Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Smith, the CEO of Fortify Rights, and we are very grateful to be here with you today.
Hi, and I'm Amy Smith, the Executive Director of Fortify Rights. Matthew and I are truly honored to be here today and to join this awesome network of people working to end human trafficking. When we first got the message from Fuzz and Carolyn asking to be the keynote address, we thought, they must have the wrong Smiths. I mean, there are a lot of us out there. But then when they told us that they wanted us to speak on the topic of navigating the complicated terrain of working with communities as an outsider, well, then we just figured they probably couldn't get anyone else. So we're on to you guys. But this is a topic that is central to our theory of change, and it's something we think a lot about. We're happy to share our experiences, but also to learn from others. Just by way of introduction, Matthew and I co-founded Fortify Rights in 2013. In short, we both found ourselves in Southeast Asia, then we found each other, and then we founded Fortify Rights in exactly that order. Well, Fortify Rights started as a mighty team of 2 in 2013. We've since become a massive team of 19 human rights defenders. Most of our team members are from the communities where we work. Most are women or minorities, and all of us are committed to ensuring rights for all. But why Fortify Rights? This is a question that we ask ourselves and find answers to every single day. We started Fortify Rights because of a need. In Myanmar, we saw and we continue to see men, women, and children being killed, arrested, and tortured because of their ethnicity, their religious beliefs, or their political opinions. In Bangladesh, we saw and we continue to see hundreds of thousands of Rohingya survivors of persecution and genocide being confined to overcrowded and ill-equipped camps or sent to remote islands without adequate support. In Thailand, we saw and we continue to see human rights defenders facing prolonged criminal sentences or imprisonment simply for standing up or speaking out on issues of concern. And we also saw and we continue to see how communities affected by human rights violations provide fertile ground for human trafficking as traffickers prey on the desperation of survivors and their hope for a better life. At the heart of all these horrors are communities that are often exceedingly knowledgeable and aware of the problems that they face. And they're also very much aware about what needs to happen in order to address the problem. So why do these problems still exist? Well, in some cases, affected communities might not have the technical resources to credibly document their story or the story of others in order to achieve their objective. In some cases, communities might not have access to the people who are able to change that situation. And in many cases, communities may fear severe reprisals for truth-telling or seeking out the truth. When communities lack technical capacity, access, or protection to address the problems that they face, there's a potential for violations to become normalized and the cycle of abuse to continue. We're working to end this cycle. So we do this by ensuring communities affected by violations have the tools that they need to document their truths, that they have access to opportunities to directly engage power holders on their situation, and most critically, that they have sufficient protection to exercise their rights and speak truth to power without fear of repercussion. We're not speaking for them or about them, but we're speaking with them. By working closely hand in hand with communities, we're not just addressing violations that happened in the past or present day, we're working to prevent violations in the future. And we know it's working because we have mountains of evidence to show that it is. As human rights workers, we're crazy about data. Collecting and analyzing information is all part of the job. And in addition to collecting human rights information, we're also collecting and recording data on our contributions as well as the impacts that we're making in the world. Since we started Fortify Rights, we've recorded more than 1,400 outputs. This includes long-form investigative reports exposing violations and recommending solutions, op-eds that have been published in some of the world's leading news outlets. We've had strategic meetings with high-level government officials and other decision makers, as well as conducting trainings and convenings with community-level partners. These outputs have contributed to changing more than 80 laws, policies, and practices. That means we've helped to bring 80 laws, policies, and practices in line with human rights standards. In real terms, these impacts translate into accountability for perpetrators of atrocities, the release of wrongfully detained human rights defenders, the reunification of families separated by arbitrary imprisonment, and restrictions being lifted and freedoms restored. So we can see that change is definitely possible. But in considering our data, what we see is that investigations alone, the process of collecting and documenting human rights violations, that's not going to achieve results on its own. Similarly, singularly engaging people with power on potential solutions aren't going to achieve impacts, nor will simply strengthening the work of human rights defenders or affected communities. What we see is that change requires all three. We need to investigate the problem to understand the problems and the solutions. We need to engage people with power on how to advance those solutions. And we need to strengthen communities affected by violations to ensure sustainable change takes place. But we can see that our theory of change is working not only in the table and charts that we have, but we can see it working in real life stories of survivors, of the survivors that we work with, as well as the communities that we're working in. And from here, I'll pass it over to Matthew to give some illustrations of our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'd like to share with you all a few illustrations of our work with Rohingya from Myanmar specifically. But before I do that, I'd just like to add a few additional points that speak to how we do what we do. As Amy mentioned, we spend our time in equal parts across the three components of our theory of change: investigate, engage, and strengthen. This means we spend considerable time investigating and documenting human rights violations. So we go to the places where violations happened or are happening, and we collect evidence. This can be eyewitness or survivor testimony, photos, video, or other material. While documenting human rights violations may seem fairly straightforward, it is one of our team's more complex activities. We take it seriously, and we take great care to not only do no harm, but also to actively ensure that we're doing good. And I'm sure we can all, conjure some examples of otherwise well-intentioned organizations or individuals inadvertently contributing to problems in this space. So I think when human rights work is done poorly, it can most certainly do harm. Apart from inducing personal trauma, some organizations might use or regard local survivors merely as sources of information in service to their own agendas. Others might use a tragic situation as an opportunity to make the story about themselves or their organization and all the good work that they're doing. Still others might regard survivors or victims as subjects in need of saving, thereby implicitly and usually inadvertently removing that survivor's input from the very equation that is meant to help them. So at Fortify Rights, our philosophy of human rights documentation hinges on ensuring witnesses or survivors or others are not merely sources of information, but rather full participants in the truth-telling process. This is a core value. It permeates all of the work that our team is doing throughout Southeast Asia. It affects the questions we ask, it affects the directions that we go, and ultimately it affects the final impacts of our work. We certainly do not have all the answers, but our team does practice this fundamental value of respect that is very simple, but sometimes lacking in our world. With regard to more substantive illustrations of our work, over the years, we've worked very closely with the Rohingya community, which is, of course, native indigenous to Myanmar, as well as other communities throughout Southeast Asia. With regard to the Rohingya specifically, we've worked to end and remedy human trafficking, to ensure justice for genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, and to end other crimes and indignities that they face daily and continue to face daily. For several years, as one example, we've hosted an annual Rohingya strategy meeting. These meetings, simple enough, they convene members of the Rohingya community to provide physical space for those in attendance to essentially set realistic, winnable objectives and to map out the strategies to achieve those objectives. Extraordinarily, the group has achieved numerous somewhat significant or even major objectives that were set at those annual meetings. For example, some years ago in 2016, the group decided that an independent international investigation would be important to further establish the facts of the atrocities that were happening in Myanmar, to get the attention of governments, to get governments to act. And so building on that decision and strategy, we fanned out to different locations, to key locations internationally with our Rohingya colleagues to press relevant governments to create this independent investigation. This work led the UN Human Rights Council to pass a resolution creating the UN fact-finding mission. That fact-finding mission in turn went on to document and further expose the Rohingya genocide. And that in turn, combined with our independent reporting as well as the independent reporting of a number of other excellent organizations, led the Gambia, of all countries, to file a genocide case at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in The Hague. So the ripples in that case are evident. That case continues. Similarly, years ago with Rohingya colleagues, we had decided to focus attention on getting Myanmar army soldiers to The Hague, individual soldiers, toward criminal responsibility for mass atrocities. The hope was that they would face international justice at the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Many people told us we were crazy. Many people told us that members of the Tatmadaw would never end up in The Hague, would never face an independent, impartial court in The Hague. Our efforts in this area culminated with a months-long operation that resulted in 2 Myanmar Army soldiers being transferred to The Hague on September 9th last year. They're now the first ever perpetrators from Myanmar in the hands of the ICC. Human trafficking, which you all know very well, has also been a scourge among the Rohingya community. Fortify Rights is not, we're not an expressly anti-human trafficking organization, but we do work on ending trafficking when it is occurring in the communities where we're working. So some of you may be aware of what has traditionally been known as the sailing season for Rohingya people. This is the period during the hot season when Rohingya tend to flee Myanmar and Bangladesh in greater numbers due to the calmer seas. Over the years, we noticed that with every uptick of atrocities against Rohingya, more human trafficking followed. To this day, when Rohingya board ships from Bangladesh or Myanmar, they're typically deceived by operatives of transnational criminal syndicates into thinking they'll be comfortably taken directly to Malaysia, where they're told riches await them. Instead, these passengers become abductees, held in conditions of enslavement for the purposes of exploitation. They're crammed into boats, denied adequate food, water, and space. We've documented killings and rape and beatings and other abuses at sea on these ships. So for years, once in Thailand, traffickers typically herded their Rohingya captives like animals into horrific camps in remote jungle areas where their victims either could buy their freedom for a hefty price tag of $2,000 US or the equivalent, or they would be sold or potentially sold into another situation of exploitation, including things like debt bondage and other scenarios. So back in 2015, we had documented evidence of the existence of these death camps and mass graves of Rohingya on Thai and Malaysian territory. We documented hundreds of survivor testimonies. We rented boats and took to the seas in search of survivors. We visited Thai immigration detention centers with Rohingya human rights defenders, pressuring the authorities to free survivors of trafficking. And we traveled to the US to testify before Congress at a hearing related to the annual TIP report. So just prior to testifying in DC, we met senior Thai officials. At the time, we shared what we planned to testify about. We wanted them to know what we would say to Congress. We also shared with them what we would not say to Congress, what we omitted from our testimony. And in that particular case, that was the situation of mass graves. We were still collecting more information, but we also wanted to give the authorities an opportunity to do the right thing. At the time, the government denied the existence of the trafficking camps, denied the existence of the mass graves. Still, we wanted to give them an opportunity to do the right thing. So we told them what we knew and said we would eventually publish all of the information, including information about mass graves, if it weren't otherwise exposed and dealt with. 8 days later, the headline was that the Thai authorities had discovered mass graves of Rohingya trafficking victims. So combined with a lot of great work by a great number of organizations, this in turn led to what was the largest human trafficking trial in Southeast Asian history. It sparked an investigation, which led to prosecutions, which led to convictions. So that trial concluded in Thailand in 2017. The court ultimately convicted 62 traffickers, 9 of whom were government officials, which was extraordinary. And for a final illustration, also related to the Rohingya situation, in 2017 and 2018, you may recall the Myanmar army was attacking Rohingya civilians in Rakhine State, in a number of townships in Rakhine State, on an unprecedented scale. So at the time, we were meeting governments, we were meeting with diplomats, senior UN officials, other people who could help change the negative outcome to a more positive outcome. We were trying to prompt action. So we shared evidence that we had collected, evidence that genocide and crimes against humanity were unfolding. And in some of our meetings, we got the impression that certain people in positions of power believed that Rohingya themselves were somehow incapable of documenting credible, reliable, objective facts about their situation. We've since come to realize this is, of course, not a problem that is unique to Myanmar or the Rohingya, but it's a much more widespread issue. And unfortunately, many people do believe, for various ill-conceived reasons, that persecuted people cannot objectively represent themselves. We obviously disagree, and this particular scenario inspired a participatory action research project with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. For those who aren't aware, participatory action research is more than NGO jargon. It means that the project was community-supported, community-driven, and action-oriented. In this particular case, the project lasted almost 2 years, and we published some of the findings in a publication, in a report called The Torture in My Mind. The project ended up focusing on Rohingya mental health. Interestingly, the team comprising 10 residents in the refugee camps in Bangladesh determined the scope and the content of a survey that they later administered. And the questions focused in large part on the situation of the mental health among the refugee community and survivors of atrocities. The photos in that report were taken by Saiful Omi. He's an award-winning Bangladeshi photographer and a good friend and colleague. Omi ensured that the photo shoot was consistent with the participatory methodology. The Rohingya photographed in the report decided for themselves how they'd like to be photographed. And in the captions in the report, they explain their decisions. They explain the rationale behind their decisions. Regarding the data in that report, we found that upwards of 90% of the refugee population in Bangladesh is experiencing depression, and more than 60% are experiencing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. There are more than 1 million Rohingya living in Bangladesh in these camps. So these figures, when we compare them to other similar situations of mass atrocities in which there's available data, it's clear to us that these findings are off the charts. The research of that project also provided evidence that the Rohingya mental health crisis is largely rooted in the genocidal attacks, in pervasive human rights violations, and impunity. This was somewhat novel, given that surprisingly, there had been very little, if any, studies dedicated to the long-term mental health impacts of human rights violations generally. So while culturally appropriate psychosocial care is an urgent demand, we reasoned with the team from the camps in Bangladesh that a purely psychosocial response would be insufficient. To solve the crisis, governments must address the root causes. Perpetrators of mass atrocity crimes are still roaming free in Myanmar, as we can see with the horrific violations taking place as we speak. with in the aftermath of the military coup that occurred on February 1st. And those military leaders and perpetrators must be held accountable. So there's a lot more. There's a lot more to do, of course, and there's certainly a lot more to say about that project and some of the other work. But I think perhaps it's best coming from members of the research team themselves. And so please have a look at this short video to follow. And thank you so much. I look forward to discussing this and other issues with you. Thank you.
Funi ati lasam mata air ki horar o mare ara dilur butor buzurde ara dilur mate zetorilla sisokol budamadi jiram e sisokol tomara anno tu fayo hon tu in kengur fayo abarara in zanayo kengur faro tomara to hen hoyarda se ta narar besha beshi kisu mai hoyda se sokot fani ala gale hander ar kisu eda se tajumi ke ugi goy o mare ara ke mate thonle haro tokol buzurgar gudi in ara kisu hoyar in begin ara khalot ara khata kol ara duko kol ara dorot kol tomara toire ni ala nodi kol ara kunai do de ara to ya tomara ri antu jatu gudi tomara no tomara da sara mai tajo goy ara te tomara da sara ro mumike ndil hangori ho ladde ara da o sha Allah ara nijo hokka nijo lere porma jaga jundi tomara da sara hangin gorodde he durhi dara ya buziya shien hoyri tar da se bishi kushi kol zahir gujjar Ajuda se training no hoyere da se community zaire modod gujum boyen hoyere da se kan bishi kushi hasel hoyere da se igwa hon bishi dormore insan gonni indela kada bishi boot feel gojilam zenni ki ar jatire ay zaire buzai hoyere tar santire ay da su kesu bujuli fajum hoyere
I really interested to work with my Rohingya as being I am a Rohingya. Also, I came to know that how much the Myanmar government persecuted, torture and genocide by the Myanmar government to us.
Even mother Sabigaris that only I came Pura Kunsiniji, but the insan or hawk of color Hoduniki Maji, Hoduniki Toziadi, Mavon and the Hoduniki Maniki, Gujiri Hindilla, Nigeran is a Dunokola, and Huede Tajilam, Sabi Baguriba, Furuskamani, Haidian. Gujida was on, Tosia Veda was on, Bulehana was on, Majida was on, Hindilla, Deka, Colbania, and Mother Shikushka.